All right, well, thank you GitLab for hosting and having us here today. Today we're going to kick this webinar off and walk you through the findings from the State of DevOps 2021 report. It's a large effort that we've been working on for the last year, a large group of contributors, authors. The list is extremely long of everyone that helped, and including some of the people on the call may have participated. So we thank you for doing so. And we also thank GitLab for being a sponsor. Just couldn't have done it without all of our sponsors. Today, I and Eric are on the call, and we're going to walk you through some of the findings. I'm a human factors psychologist. What does that mean? It means that I study the systems that people work in and how those systems affect those people. And so in this context, I study DevOps and how can teams be most effective in developing and deploying software. And I've been doing this for quite a few years. I've been working on the DORA project for a few years itself, but I've been studying developer tools for quite a while as well. Eric, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. I'm Eric Maxwell. I lead the application modernization practice here at Google in EMEA. And while Dustin has been studying the tools, I've been using them and walking customers through DevOps transformations, early adopter practitioner in DevOps, created the DevOps transformation program here at Google, ex-chef, et cetera, et cetera. But mostly experienced the pain of 18-hour deploys and all the badness that went along with it, and realized that there had to be something different. So that kind of kicked me off on this journey, and here I am.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I think I can speak for Eric and say that we're both happy to be here and happy to walk you through our experience and the research here. So let's first start with a section on how the industry itself is evolving, something that we do every DORA report, where we look at how things are progressing, how quickly are people deploying, how slowly in some circumstances, and how quickly can they recover? How many failures do they have? So let's walk you through how the industry is changing. Year over year, we see signs that the industry is evolving. In 2018, for example, it was our first signal that there was this elite performance team category, and they only made up 7% of the sample. And in 2019, we saw a large increase in that group, and elite performers made up 20% of the sample. And in this year, they're even larger. And you'll also see that high performers have also increased in size. And this suggests that this population has continued to improve, made meaningful changes, and been able to deploy more quickly and more often.
Yeah, when I look at this, it's really amazing, because when you take the high and the elite performers and you put them together, it's basically 2/3 of the responders. And that's pretty phenomenal, especially when you think back and reflect where we were and where we are today. And this really does speak to the continuous improvement. We like to say in DevOps that this is a continuous journey, a journey with no end. And this really shows us that that's true. And I think the key takeaway here is that if you're not continuously improving, you're falling behind. And I think that's a real big point, real big takeaway here.
Yeah, +1. But what does it mean to be elite? And this slide is purely illustrative, right? And we're just trying to show what makes an elite performing team different than a low performing team, particularly in terms of how we assess and create these performance categories. We use 4 different metrics. Those are deployment frequency, lead time for changes, change failure rate, and time to recover from an incident. And so what you'll see here is the magnitude of difference between these performance categories. So elite performers make 973 times more code deployments than low performers. They are faster for their lead time for change, 6,570 times faster. The same for recovery from an incident, 6,570 times. This is what happens when you use medians to make comparisons. That's why both of those numbers are the same. And their change failure rate is 3 times lower than low performers. But one thing to keep in mind is that these numbers are just the outcome of our model, right? This is kind of the goalpost. This is what you're trying to improve. And Eric, what do you think of that?
Yeah, so I think that these numbers are amazing, but I would caution folks to not look at these numbers and think, oh my gosh, this is not something that we could ever achieve, and therefore, not really put forth the effort, because even small improvements in any of these categories can have profound improvements on a lot of different aspects of what you're doing. Business performance, culture, burnout, and really your overall happiness can be improved by just by just improving some of these capabilities. But I would also say that it's easy to get wrapped up in the 4 keys, but really what we want to focus in on are the individual capabilities behind the 4 keys. And so, as an example, if you improve your frequency of deployments, the side effect is that you'll have more confidence the next time you deploy. I remember, when I was struggling a bit, sort of in the beginning when I was first learning about DevOps, and most of my week or my couple of weeks was really amazing when I was coding and writing new software on my machine. And then as it came time for release, my mood would change, and I would start getting anxious and nervous, knowing that the release was probably going to fail and it was going to be very, very painful. And so the more releases you do, the better you get in that area, the more confidence you have. And so the more that your efficiency increases, you build confidence. When you're able to do more releases, you're able to start competing more in the market, competing with your competition. You're able to start doing more interesting things like A/B testing, etc. When you have less outages, the side effect of that is higher customer satisfaction. And we all know how important it is for retaining customers. So you can see that, as you start doing things, as you start decreasing your change failure rate, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. When I would work with customers and they would say, this is great, give me the DevOps, how much does it cost, and how soon can we have it? You would kind of have to laugh and take a level set and say, this is a long-term journey. So while these numbers might be amazing or daunting, depending on what your perspective is, the point is change is happening, it's possible, and even the smallest amount of change can really have great effects.
So here we just wanted to show how these 4 metrics have changed from our 2019 assessment to our 2021 assessment. And you'll see that overall our elite performers have increased in how frequently they deploy. They are doing it faster, they're recovering faster. Well, one thing to note is that their change failure rate isn't or the low performers change failure rate has improved, we saw, which is encouraging. It suggests that low performance category has invested in fewer failures, but not so much in the speed that they're delivering. Anything you'd like to add there, Eric?
Yeah, when I was thinking about this, and I meant to ask you before the webcast, but might as well do it live. Do we have any data to suggest that this is because companies are shipping less frequently, which is why they have less change, the change failure rate is less?
It's entirely possible. And it's likely that in decreasing your releases, it's a strategy for trying to reduce the number of failures, which is something that we see quite often, actually.
Yeah, because I was thinking, while your confidence decreases, that would also have a knock-on effect of, well, maybe we won't release as often.
Yeah, and I think that by doing that strategy, though, you miss a lot of the benefits that we were speaking to on the prior slide.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things that stood out to me from this year's data set is that the low performers got worse. We don't have that graph here, but across the board in all of the other metrics, when you look at low performers and what their abilities are, like as an example, low performers used to be able to ship, I think in 2019 it was, once a week to once a month to every 6 months, and now it's 6 months or more for a low performer. So while we've seen the high and the elites and everybody else move forward and get better, we've actually seen the low performers get worse, and that's interesting.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about the outcome of implementing DevOps practices, but we haven't talked a lot about what those practices should be. And this year we investigated multiple areas, and we're going to walk you through some of the areas that we investigated most deeply. And the first of which that we're going to talk about is cloud. And Eric, can you tell us a little bit about what we saw with cloud this year?
Yeah, cloud has been indicated from our research in past years as being a key to high-performing organizations, and we see that data continue. Those points continue to be true through the research. So we've seen an adoption in cloud computing up 5%, public cloud 5% for 2019. 56% of those folks indicate that they are that they're using cloud, so 56% of responders. Some really interesting data around multi and hybrid cloud. So we've seen an increased adoption in multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, and we've seen a 1.6 times more likely to exceed organizational performance targets by adopting multi and hybrid cloud strategies. We also see that companies that do this are 1.4 times more likely to excel in all 5 keys. Now, I just want to pause and talk about this idea of 5 key characteristics of cloud. We didn't just take a look and say, hey, does a company use cloud infrastructure? We very specifically looked at, are they utilizing the 5 key characteristics of cloud? And that's really important, because what we see time and time again with companies is they move to the cloud, but they don't realize the benefits of the cloud. And in fact, I just saw some analyst research that said that 80% of CIOs claim that they are not happy with their move to the cloud, and they have not seen the gains and the things that they've been promised. So like when people like myself come in and say, hey, move to the cloud, it's going to be sparkle ponies and unicorns all day long. That's true, but you can't just lift and shift. And this is the key right here, are these 5 key characteristics of cloud. You have to adopt the areas of cloud computing. You have to use on-demand service, broad network access, elasticity, measured service, resource pooling. These are the 5 key characteristics. And what we see is that companies that fall into the elite category are 3.5 times more likely to do all 5. Any other things to add here, Dustin? Because I could go all day with stats and amazingness.
No, I think that's a great way to summarize it. And I think one thing that's super encouraging about this data, and you'll see that in the blue parenthetical and points there for each of the characteristics, is that not only did we see an increase in cloud adoption, we also saw percent increases in adoption of these key characteristics, which I think is a really good sign. It shows that it's not always just lift and shift. It does show that people are starting to leverage the cloud more and more, which I think is great.
Yeah, but before we move on, one thing I also wanted to mention is when we talk about multi and hybrid cloud, another stat that came out that was very compelling to me is that multi-cloud adopters were 1.5 times more likely to meet the reliability targets. And so, when we talk about why are companies moving to multi-cloud, what are the reasonings behind it? We see that leveraging unique benefits of cloud is the #1 reason. I feel like that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Utilizing best-in-class technologies, that makes sense. Availability is number two, and then the third point on that is disaster recovery. So, especially interesting because this year we started looking at reliability as the fifth key and taking a deeper look at SRE and operational performance. And so we can see a direct connection in reliability targets directly connected to a multi-cloud strategy.
Yeah, +1 to everything that you said there. One thing I'm just super excited to talk about and share here is our investigation into documentation. This is something that we've done for the first time this year, and we took a pretty careful approach. We sought out to measure documentation quality, specifically internal documentation. And we wanted to look at what are the practices that improve documentation quality, and then what is the impact of having good docs. And I see a great question pop up in the chat, which is a pretty common question that we get, is how do you measure doc quality? And we did that with 7 characteristics that we built based on literature of how you define quality for documentation. Those are, for example, the functionality of the documentation. So can I rely on my doc set to be able to accomplish my tasks? That's a key component of this, is that are you confident that when you're using your documentation that you're going to be able to find the answer to your question? If you don't have that confidence, quality is likely to be pretty low. But we also ask about things like clarity and organization, structure. Like, can I reliably scan through the doc and understand where to find information once I know I have the right doc? We did it through several different ways. You can read more about that in the full report, but Eric, why don't you walk us through what the benefits of having good docs are?
Yeah, so Dustin and I were kind of having a bit of a laugh on this topic yesterday when we were kind of reviewing for this. And, surprisingly, this is one of the most amazing parts of the research for this year. And, you don't normally think of documentation as being, the most exciting topic. But when we look at the stats that we have at the bottom of the screen here, there is a really high multipliers let me start over. Documentation plays a really big part in key ways that you can up-level your overall business performance. So when we think about, before I was talking about that, utilization of 5 keys of cloud is one of the biggest predictors of high performance. Well, documentation and good documentation and companies that are able to do it are 2.5 times more likely to utilize cloud. Then we can look at things like reliability. And we maybe should have showed this slide after the SRE and the security ones, but we can show in our data this year that reliability and SRE practices have a direct relationship to overall business performance. And we can also show that security and having security in your supply chain has a direct relationship to overall business performance. And documentation affects all 3 of those categories. So it really is one of those things that we all kind of knew in the back of our heads, but we tried to push it aside because we don't all love doing documentation and it requires upkeep, etc. But this really, I think, hopefully, this will make people, I guess, care more about documentation, and it just sort of provides the data for the things that we already knew in the back of our heads.
Yeah, I completely agree. Similarly, we also looked at SRE practices for the first time. And one of the main things I wanted to call out about this is that a common misconception and a reasonable assumption about how we might have done this in the research was that we just asked people, are you doing SRE, right? Or do you have SREs at your organization? And I'd like to reassure you that that was not our approach at all. And in fact, what we instead focused on were what are the key recommendations or what is that key set of criteria that SRE prescribes or says organizations should do in order to be doing SRE? And we never explicitly asked about SRE. And so that's how we looked at this. Are they doing the specific practices that are recommended by our friends in that community? And if so, how does that impact things like our performance outcomes, reliability, and the business? Eric, take it from there. How does it affect those things?
Yeah, so before I get into that, one of the things that really stood out to me with this is that we can see a clear complement between SRE and DevOps. There's been a lot of chatter in the industry over the years, what's SRE, what's DevOps, where do they overlap, how do they work with each other? And so we really see the companies that do both SRE and DevOps practices see the most benefit from a business perspective. Companies that have SRE practices are 1.8 times more likely to have better business outcomes, and they're 1.4 times more likely to have better delivery performance. I think one of the other things that was interesting to me in this is that elite performers are 2 times more likely to use SRE, but only 10% of those say that they are using or that they have implemented every SRE practice. So to me, this shows that there's a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room for growth. And now that we're starting to track this in the report, I'm really excited to see what happens in the next couple of years when that 10% turns into 50 or 60%, because I think that it's going to continue to have a profound effect.
So we also looked at security this year. And given we've seen a lot of recent attacks and vulnerabilities, particularly to the software supply chain, we wanted to revisit this topic and do a pulse check. Does security matter? Does it impact the outcomes that we care about? Does it slow things down? And to what degree have people adopted security practices? And for a long time, we've talked about shifting left on security. So Eric, what do we mean by shifting left?
Yeah, so the idea is that you want to integrate security into every stage of your software chain. So from as far left as the developer workstation, all the way out to post hoc security scanning. And we see that the elite performers are twice as likely to have security integrated into their development process. And so what's really cool about this is, like when DevOps started, it was, hey, let's break this down the silos of dev and ops. But then if you really took a hard look at what was going on, we still had a silo off to the corner, and it was the security folks. And that always kind of cracked me up inside. And I remember talking about this at conferences years and years ago about, hey, let's break down these silos with security and let's bring the security folks into every step of the process. And we're seeing that. And we're seeing that folks are prioritizing security more and more as time goes on, and with great benefit. So companies that do this are 1.6 times more likely to exceed their business goals, not just software goals, but business goals. So we're really seeing this become front and center, both for the reasons that Dustin mentioned with the very high profile software supply chain attacks of 2020, and also now that we can see a direct connection between security and business performance. And it just makes me feel good inside, actually, as an ex-security person, to see even more of the silos breaking down and seeing everybody kind of really kumbayaing now together with this kind of new paradigm. So this is really great to see.
So our final area that we wanted to talk about before we kick it off to Frank is just, we know it's been a wild past 19, 20 months now of the pandemic. And we wanted to see what's the impact of that on things in our lane, right? DORA historically looks at software delivery performance, organizational performance, and culture. And so there are plenty of other people studying the impact of COVID-19, but we wanted to see, okay, is there any effect on the measures that we typically look at? Stay within that. And surprisingly, we didn't see a decrease in performance. And if anything, from what we talked about earlier, we saw increases in speed and stability. But we also saw a lot of burnout in our sample. And we're not the only people to find this kind of finding. A lot of people are experiencing burnout right now. And particularly, we saw a lot of people had burnout when they had to work from home for the first time during this period, this big adjustment, feeling isolated. But what I wanted to leave you with was this one finding that when we look at the people that had to work from home for the first time, those that were most successful had an extremely positive team culture, a generative team culture. They felt included, they felt like they belonged on their team, and they were half as likely to experience burnout. And so, given the time that we're in right now, it was semi-encouraging to see that there are teams out there that are doing better, and they're doing so by focusing on their team culture and helping people feel included, feel belong. I often think about like the people that actually joined new teams during this period that have never physically been next to those people, and how isolating that might feel if the culture isn't set up in such a way to pull them in even virtually. So this is kind of what we'll leave you with, is just it matters. And we also find that culture matters historically in terms of value driven to the business. So it's not just about burnout, it's also about performance outcomes in terms of speed, stability, and the business. So with that, I just wanted to close here and give a big thank you to everyone who listened. We're going to hand it off to Frank. But if you want full access to the report, you want to see everything that we talked about, check out cloud.google.com/DevOps. But yes, thank you so much. And Frank, take it from here.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. It's very interesting stuff there. So I will take over sharing. All right. So I hope everybody's doing well. We'll get started on our DevOps journey here at Genworth. So who am I? I'm Frank Ford. I'm a senior IT architect for Genworth. I've been with the company for 15 years, and I'm also a graduate of Virginia Tech, so go Hokies. A little bit about Genworth. We're an insurance company, primarily dealing with long-term care and mortgage insurance. And we were founded as a life insurance company in Virginia all the way back in 1871. Our primary office locations are in Richmond, Virginia, which is our headquarters location, Lynchburg, Virginia, and Raleigh, North Carolina. I work out of the Lynchburg office, just in case anybody's interested. All right, so like any good journey, we've got to start at the beginning. So kind of what were we doing prior to adopting DevOps as being a primary practice within the organization? Well, we were mainly a Java Enterprise and .NET shop. So we had a lot of custom build scripts, multiple technologies were involved, dealing with multiple version control repositories and limited access to certain machines kind of in the data center meant that our data center maintained a lot of this stuff for us. So you had to, do stuff via ticket. Also, there's a change management team that was responsible for handling deployment. So you would get your deployment, your deployable, you'd, attach your deployment SOP to it. You would then write any custom instructions that were needed for that particular deployment, attach a SQL script, do something fun like that. Write all that up into a ticket and hand it off to the change management team, and you'd cross your fingers that it was, done correctly at the appropriate time. So as we had some more folks start to filter in, and we got some younger developers on the team, we noticed that there were a handful of folks that were running some builds locally on their laptops, and we kind of started asking some questions. And then the big thing that we got was, well, I don't really feel like maintaining these archaic build scripts that are running on this old Linux box over here. I'd rather just, dump my deployable out of the IDE and keep moving on with life. They also weren't checking in code because they said that CVS was not super duper friendly to them. So red flags immediately started to go up. And we said, okay, so we have code that's not checked in. We have stuff that's not backed up. We have no way of auditing this. And these are the builds that are ultimately winding up on our production systems. So this is not something that we could ignore. So we said, all right, how do we go about fixing the problem? So at least in our organization, there's really kind of two ways that things kind of get started. You have, a top-down approach where folks say, hey, here's how we're going to do business, and you kind of adopt it and integrate it into your practices, or you kind of have a grassroots thing and you do it from the bottom up. In this case, this was a grassroots effort where some of us said, all right, we have a problem, we need to figure out what the best way to address it is. The first thing that we did was looked at our version control system, because that was probably the biggest risk that we had, in that our source code was sitting on numerous people's local machines. And, I have seen these things get run over by a car before. So there's certainly a massive amount of risk that we have unrecoverable damage that could happen there. So we standardized on Git as our version control system. This is where GitLab came into play for us, and our DevOps journey has kind of mirrored a lot of the functionality that GitLab has put into the platform. We've tried to adopt the features that they've added. After we standardized on Git as being our version control system of preference, the next thing we did was we started adopting CI/CD pipelines. And the thing I want to make sure here is that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. You don't have to do continuous integration and the deployment side of the house. You can just focus on the build side and put your build artifact in an artifact repository, like a Sonatype Nexus or a JFrog artifactory, or wherever you want to put the artifact, and then have another process that goes and handles that. You can always come back and handle the deployment side. So after you kind of get into this and you start adopting, these practices, the next thing that you can start to take a look at, the next thing that we started to take a look at is application modernization. How do we start to fit some of our legacy applications, or how do we start to replace some of our legacy applications with more modern? And for us, that meant a lot of application containers. And for us, it makes our life significantly easier because we can package everything into a container image, and then we can deploy that image, and things just kind of work. But that's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. Everything doesn't necessarily belong in an application container. And then a lot of our stuff deals with services and kind of moving data back and forth. So container orchestration was very important to us, and we adopted Kubernetes as our container orchestration platform. After you kind of go through some of these, you can start getting into a little bit more advanced deployment techniques. So GitOps is something that we have also adopted that has proven very useful. I actually had a conversation with a guy this week. We were talking about a storage change that was done in a cluster that we don't actually manage via GitOps. It's one that we allow folks to have a little bit more access and freedom on. And something broke, and it kind of the light bulb starts to go off around, hey, having Git being a single source of truth and deploying your changes using GitOps, we would have more insight into what actually happened there. And then, of course, the next iteration of this is cloud, and things we had to ask ourselves: are we going to be a single cloud organization versus a multi-cloud organization? And where does hybrid cloud fit into your strategy? There's going to be certain things that may have to just remain on premises for you. You might not be able to pick up everything and move it to the cloud. So being able to move workloads from on-prem to the cloud easily and transparently, maybe, certainly makes life a whole lot easier, as well as adopting infrastructure as code. And that kind of goes back to having Git kind of be that single source of truth for a lot of your deployments. And the last thing that I will say is automate. Manual tasks introduce opportunities for error. We were talking about the change management team earlier, where you would have your SOP, you'd write your custom deployment instructions, and then you would just kind of cross your fingers that the person that was doing the deployment did everything correctly. Having automated, repeatable processes that do the same thing every time certainly reduces the opportunity for error. And you should apply this to everything, whether it's a build, whether it's a deployment, your infrastructure provisioning. All of that should follow some type of automated process. And that's all. Thank you.
Great, Frank. Thanks so much. It was a fantastic presentation about how Genworth has been able to kind of leverage what we've been talking about so far. So that's awesome. And I know we're getting up against time, but I'm going to just briefly chat about GitLab, and then there's a number of questions I'd love to have the team talk about. But real quick, oh, I'm having an issue sharing my screen. I'm not going to share my screen because Zoom doesn't want to, but I'll just talk about GitLab briefly and how it fits into this. So, what we've really seen so far today is this discrepancy between low performers and elite performers. And then they talked a little bit about, the capabilities required to help level up your organization. And then Frank talked a lot in detail about those capabilities that they had at Genworth and how they've evolved those over time. And the evolution we've seen in GitLab, is this evolution from, teams trying to implement DevOps, trying to implement some of these best practices, but over time, kind of struggling with the tooling that they have and not being able to really understand, how those things fit together, or if they do fit together, spending a lot of time fitting those tools together. And so what we've seen in the separation between the elite performers and the lower performers really is this move from kind of a bring your own tool where every team brings their own tool to a DIY DevOps where we have all these different tools and we stitch them together, and maybe we do that inefficiently, or maybe we just spend a lot of time and effort in doing that, to really this move towards the DevOps platform. So many of the most elite performers now are using DevOps platforms to simplify the tool chain that they have when it comes from getting that code tested and deployed, right? That deployment frequency, increasing that and moving themselves up in a maturity level. And so that's really what we've seen at GitLab. And that's why GitLab is the DevOps platform, right? We have that tooling to go all the way from, learning about the idea and, ideating around what are we going to build, to building it, making sure that code is going to be secure and tested, to deploying that code into production. And so that's really what GitLab is focused on, and how we're focused on helping teams move from, into being elite performers, hopefully, over the next year or so as they mature their DevOps practices. And so with that, I'd love to bring back Eric and Dustin and Frank and just chat through. There's been a lot of great questions. If you have any other questions while we're chatting, please feel free to use that Q&A feature. You'll find it on the bottom of your Zoom window. It has a little chat windows together and Q&A written under it. So feel free to send in your questions. I know one question that's kind of a logistical one for us has been about getting the slideshow or getting this presentation. So the short answer is yes. The presentation is being recorded, and we'll be able to send that to everyone that attended, as well as everyone that was registered, just a couple of days after we're done the webinar. So looking at the questions first, I'll just read these off. I think Dustin and Eric, this mostly focused towards you. The question is my understanding correct that the improvements are X% compared with the day, not using CI/CD and DevOps? Is there a comparison of Y on Y, year-on-year improvements in existing CI and DevOps? So maybe you can talk about how those year-over-year comparisons are made and how that is influenced there.
Yeah, I think that we get a similar question to this, and I'll try and riff on this a bit because I'm not 100% clear I understand the question. But the way that we look at this longitudinally is we don't have a way to identify an organization year over year. So we can't look at the same pipeline and then follow that group year over year. And we do that on purpose. That's like a privacy reason. We don't want to be able to attach responses from 2018 to responses to 2021 purely out of privacy concerns. Methodologically, it would be best to be able to say, oh, it's these groups that are truly progressing. Like I have confidence that this person or this team was once a medium performer and then became an elite performer over the last 3 years. Like from a researcher's perspective, that'd be great. I love that. But what I have to do is I have to rely on, well, we're gonna sample the same group, the same channels, keep it consistent as much as possible as we can year over year. And we're gonna use the same language in the questions and reassess. Control for things like industry, company size, region around the world, and try to see, keeping all of that constant, do we see changes? At the team level, that's something that I highly encourage people to, retool it and self-assess, and then self-assess again in 6 months, and then do it in a year as well, and see how, as you take meaningful steps towards modernizing or DevOps or using new tooling, are you seeing meaningful improvements every 6 months or so as you add these new changes? Eric, I'd love to hear your perspective on how we usually help customers do this at Google.
Yeah, so one of the things I was going to mention before we signed off before is we have something called the DORA Quick Check that's available on our website. And I think it's that same link, cloud.google.com/DevOps. You can get to the quick check. Otherwise, if you just Google DORA Quick Check, you'll find it. But it's really cool. It's a couple of quick questions that you can just take online, multiple choice, and it uses the DORA data as the backing, and it will give you an idea of where you're at currently, and then give you some recommendations based on the analysis that we've done with companies and in the research into areas that you can start improving on. And there are the capabilities that we mentioned earlier, and we give you some information as to how you can start implementing those capabilities if you haven't already, how you can improve the capabilities, and how you can start measuring those capabilities. And we also go into detail about common pitfalls around what to watch out for when you're implementing these capabilities.
Great. No, that's helpful. And so the other two questions, so there was a lot of focus on kind of the year over year stats. And that's always a very interesting thing to me as someone who's followed the DORA research for some time. So one question is, did the change failure rate then get worse? Like, I think you talked about that a little bit. So talk about that, everybody likes up and to the right graphs, right? And so that the one that's not, I think, throws people off. Can you talk a little bit more about, I know you spoke about a little bit, but that change failure rate change.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for elite performers, no, it stayed at the top of performance. For low performers, it improved. And if my memory serves me correctly, medium and high performers saw a slight shift down in performance there. So low performers caught up to where the medium performers and the high performers are today, but elite performers stayed at the top of performance. I hope that adds some clarification. And you can see those more detailed breakdown in the full report as well.
Great. And then a similar question. Would love to hear more on the change from availability in the 2019 report to reliability in the 2021 report. It's actually a question I had too, so I'm glad for someone asking that in chat. What capabilities and practices are more predictive of reliability, for instance?
Yes, I think that's great. So this actually came through trying to work with our SRE partners at Google. And initially when we started that partnership and trying to understand how we could integrate SRE into the research program, we were saying things like, well, we have looked at availability before, and we know that that is closely related to what you all focus on. Availability is something that's really important to SRE. And, I'm not going to be proud and say that like I argued, but what they came back to us and says, well, that philosophically, what they believe is that availability is really a subset of reliability, and that there are many different facets of reliability that you can measure in addition to availability. So what we wanted to do was expand it into something a little more general and look at reliability targets as a whole. And we both agreed that felt more appropriate rather than just focus on availability, focus on all of the facets. And then for this year, what we looked at in terms of increasing reliability, the capabilities we mainly focused on were those that were from SRE. So do you set SLAs? Do you define them so that they are user-centered, for example? Do you have error budgets, right? Are you allowing your development teams to make a certain amount of errors, and that's okay? So that's kind of the rationale for the shift and just some of the things that we looked at to impact reliability specifically.
Great. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And one more question, again, from someone who's following DORA real close. So they're gonna ask all the pointed questions. It says, I think you dropped the larger research diagram in 2021, the one that shows capabilities predictive of SDO performance, constructs, et cetera. Was that intentional? Can we expect to see a new diagram with capabilities predictive of reliability maybe next year in 2022, or yeah?
Yeah, this was, it's not dropped. It actually is still in there. You just have to look more closely. There's a footnote at the how do we improve chapter section that will link you to an online resource of the diagram, and you can get access to it there. It's open to everyone. It doesn't have any sort of, like there's no paywall or anything. You can get right in there and take a look at it. And it was more of a design decision than anything else. We wanted the report to just read end to end. And if you wanted to dig in deeper and see the actual modeling, you still can. And you can check that out online as an online resource. But that's a great question. And I'm sorry that it's not as salient. I had hoped that it would be, but if it's in a footnote, I don't know what I was hoping for.
Sure. Well, there's value in it, obviously. I know it's one that I often talk about and summarize, so I can see that, like, not maybe confusing the rest of the data with that diagram. There's something to be said for that. But I think when you're talking about, when you're talking to folks who are trying to understand, and the next and last question kind of goes to this too, how do we justify this as a business? Like, it's really strong, right? The correlation between software delivery performance and organizational performance. And it's one I think many of us in the industry kind of just innately accept at this point, but it's like, I think in business, it's something we still have to always be selling. Okay, so I think as I said, we have a question or time for one last question. It says, do you evaluate cost at all with the DORA studies? How enterprise are managing the cost of their clouds? Some may be able to achieve elite performer status, for instance, but be less cost efficient. Is there any relationship there, or have you thought about examining that?
We did look at cost optimization in the 2019 report, but particularly on not necessarily on optimizing cost, but in visibility of cost is really what we looked at then. So by moving from on-prem to cloud, do you therefore have more visibility into what all of the services are costing? We saw some evidence for that, but this year we didn't look into that, and not on optimization either. So Eric, do you have anything to add there?
I don't, for once.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's something a lot of folks think about, but it's like you always have to combine that discussion with the overall business goal, right? So we had this very off topic, but I was with an SRE from GitLab who did a presentation at KubeCon last week and talked about how we went from, so we run our GitLab.com production environment in GCP, and talked about how we went from one kind of single multi-zonal cluster to individual clusters per zone, which has cost benefits, right? And cost benefits, when it comes to interzonal traffic versus the multiple clusters and running more pods and more nodes. So it's a delicate balance. And I would say the one thing is, I've seen people overcorrect for that in the past, optimize too early. It's like with anything else in engineering. You can optimize too early or you can optimize too late. So you've got to be careful about when you do it, and make sure that it's always kind of aligned with the business's goals. All right, well, great. Thanks for that fantastic discussion, everyone. Really appreciate everyone coming up. Dustin, Frank, Eric, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And then Zach, you want to help us wrap up today's webinar? That'd be great.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just want to reiterate and thank our panelists today. Fantastic conversation, really informative for our attendees. Thanks to all the attendees who were able to join today as well. Just a quick reminder that we will be sending out the recording within the next couple of days, so be on the lookout for that email. We'll have a couple follow-up events coming as well, so please feel free to sign up for those or forward those on to your teams. We'd love to continue these discussions a little bit further. So thanks again. Hope everyone has a great day.